Can you see my screen?
Yep, you are all set.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for attending today. And thank you to Liz Crowell and to Lacey for setting this up. My name is Henry Ward. I'm an archaeologist and historic preservation specialist with WSP Inc. We're an international transportation planning and construction firm. And I'm part of the environmental team that works on cultural resources. This presentation is going to be a little different than the others today because most of the work at Abingdon, where we're going to be spending most of our time, was done back in the 90s. We are doing some new research to move interpretations onto the site, but a lot of what we're going to be doing is talking about what we found out in that earlier time period. And I'm also going to take the opportunity to take you on a little bit of a tour and show you some of the hidden histories and historic treasures at both airports, both National and Dulles. Okay, so we're going to spend most of our time today talking about Abingdon. And again, I think it's one of the sort of hidden history mysteries. A lot of people don't really know exactly where it is. It is in the middle of National Airport. If you look up at the parking garage, you'll see a tree sticking up. That is the site that is left. Basically, as the airport was built, the site was got smaller and smaller until finally just the last intact piece of the site is left. And so we're going to tell the story about the history, the preservation, the archaeology, and the story that it helped to tell us about the people that live there. But before we start that, I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge the fact that when we talk about Virginia, we are talking about the homeland of the Piscataway, the Conoy, the Lenape, and to acknowledge that we are here on their land and to acknowledge their presence and their history. Okay, I also want to take an opportunity, this longer format, I'm used to a 20-minute conference where I got to talk fast and cover everything. So this one is going to give a little bit more leisurely and an opportunity even to talk a little bit about myself and archaeology and how I got into it. I actually did my undergraduate work out in Central Ohio. My mound that I excavated was nowhere near as fancy as the Serpent Mound, nor were the artifacts I found like the materials from the Adena and the Hopewell that I got to deal with when I worked at the Ohio Historical Society. But again, a good start to an archaeological career, you have to admit. I came back to the East Coast actually to do a salvage project on a small site on the Chesapeake Bay, which ended up being a very significant prehistoric site. It was actually once a part of a peninsula that appears to have been occupied for almost 9,000 years. Not only do we have points from that entire time period, but we have both the earliest type of prehistoric ceramic made in this part of the Chesapeake, the latest, and then about 12 individual ceramic forms all on this one site. And so again, this is not just a small village. This was a continually occupied mega village with connections as far out as Ohio. This is an Adena, what's called a robin's leaf-shaped blade, a ceremonial blade. It was dug from a mountain about 700 miles from where we found it in the Chesapeake Bay, and talks about, again, the trade and exchange that was happening where the Delaware, the Chesapeake, and the Susquehanna all come together. Also had an opportunity while I was at the University of Delaware doing my master's to take an adventure out to a shipwreck, the US HMS Brock off the coast of Delaware. And I want to put a plug in for anybody who goes down to Lewes to take a look at this Lonsdale Museum. And then there's also an opportunity for you to actually go and see the wreck in its conservation facility. Definitely something that's worth the trip next time you're on the Delaware shore. I also, while I was working for the city of Baltimore and Mount Clare Mansion, I did some work educational program out there. This is, again, similar to what Abingdon would have looked like probably in its heyday in terms of its situation on the hillside. And again, we only really have the postage stamp that is around the main house left. Another interesting part of the project here out at Mount Clare was underneath one of the Olmsted walkways. We ended up finding one of the few intact prehistoric sites within Baltimore City. This is the remains of a shell bin And this is a carbon date that we got, nice time period right for that late woodland. And so it remains of a 1,000-year-old oyster dinner up on the hillside at Mount Clair. My final part of the career in Baltimore City was actually doing urban archaeology. Here's an opportunity again for you to visit. If you go to the Shot Tower Metro Station in Baltimore, you can see the remains of the work we did of the Center Market neighborhood, whereas we dug underneath of the parking lot in order to build the station escalator. We came down on the remains of an 18th century set of structures that had been part of the Center Market in Baltimore, had been completely destroyed in the Great Fire, and then found and excavated by us. I was actually working on that site when I got a call from the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority about whether I would like to come down and help them with archaeology and history. And my first question was, it seems like an airport is the opposite thing from a historic site. But when we began to look into it, not only do we have 18,000 acres of archaeology out at Dulles, the remains of Abingdon Plantation at National, the little jewel of an Art Deco Terminal A at National, the first jet engine test cell actually built in the United States, and the masterpiece of the main terminal at Dulles. Between the two airports, there are 38 National Register listed or eligible historic or archaeological properties between the two airports. And we're going to end up in National, but I want to just take a second to take out to Dulles for a quick trip. This is archaeological work that was done as part of the 4th runway. One of the amazing things we found here was a series of massive prehistoric sites. This is the site, every single one of those orange flags is an artifact. There were over 20,000 artifacts in that field, 250 or so points. And so again, 18 acres and an occupation range truly astounding from literally the early part of the Archaic all the way through the woodland, and repeated occupation where people are coming back to these same landforms time after time after time. And one of the things we found out in looking at this is there was a real spike of occupation during the very early time period, this early Archaic, which are actually fairly rare in this part of Virginia. And one of the things we think is probably happening is actually climate change. During the Middle Holocene, things got really dry and really hot for a while, and people were then drawn to permanent water sources. A lot of ephemeral streams would have dried up, but the Horsepen Run is a large floodplain. It actually has a clay base to it that keeps the water pounded. And so this was a water source that people could come back to year after year, after century, eon after eon. Dulles also has a rich early historic. We were actually part of the Lee family, Sully Plantation, where Liz Crowell has a wonderful program going, is actually on airport property, and we have a long-term easement for them to operate it. And although we do cooperate on all of the historic preservation work, and we have not really found much on the airport that goes back to the historic period, except for as part of the 4th runway, we begin to pick out a little bit of evidence about the enslaved population that would have lived out on the airport. Again, we know that there would have been hundreds of slaves associated with the Sully Plantation. Some of them actually housed on the plantation, but also some of them evidently were able to go ahead and establish these small little hamlets actually scattered out on the landscape. And during our excavations for the 4th runway, we ended up finding 2 of these structures. They ended up yielding some artifacts that you might not have expected. Again, one doesn't tend to think of a slave with a gun, but again, if you're going to hunt, you have to have a gun flint. We also ended up finding an example of Afro-American made pottery. It's called Colano ware, which again is a really interesting story that we'll go back into a little more detail. The other really fascinating part of what we found here was evidence of West African sort of sacred toolkit. This is a quartz crystal that we found at one of the sites. We also found some buttons, various other kinds of artifacts that are considered to be part of this sort of sacred toolkit that you would end up either burying under the hearth or under the sill as a way of protecting the family and ensuring good luck. And so again, it's very interesting that on these sites, we are finding evidence of this continuation of an Afro-American cultural expression at the same time as they're also making their own pottery. And again, Kelowna ware is a really interesting story. We did not recognize it for a long time as archaeologists. We either thought it was some kind of a very crude utilitarian ware or really finely made Native American. We finally realized from the context that these are pots that are being made by Afro-American potters. They are attempting to make these large soup bowls that were a big part of the West African, the gumbos and the stews, but were an extremely expensive item to buy at a European ceramic shop. And so they would no way they would be able to buy these kinds of pots, but they did know where the clay was. They did know how to make pots. And so they're actually making them for themselves, which again is some of my favorite artifacts from these sites. We also found some really interesting information. We sort of compared the two sites. One appears to have been bigger, probably a larger population, and occupied longer. So whereas one site really seemed to have mostly utilitarian earthenware, the other one a little bit later seemed to have some fancier, more decorated wares. There's sort of more middle class existence, and also beginning to see personal items, tools, doll parts, which seem to talk about, again, a little bit richer material culture that was part of the later life of these enslaved and then eventually freed families. Again, this is what Dulles would have looked like before and after. And so again, we continue to do explorations out there, and we're going to be going ahead and actually putting some exhibits out that you'll be able to see that will tell you about the history of an airport in the parts that you can't really visit. And again, this is going to be talking also about the architecture of, again, probably one of the most architecturally significant and historic airports in the country, if not the world. The airport has a couple of its own little hidden treasures. I'm just going to talk about one. This is the south finger that connects the main terminal to the tower. And on that back wall is actually a piece of art that was made by Harry Bortoya, who was a classmate of Eero Saarinen, who was the architect for the airport. And again, that's still in place and quite a remarkable piece of modern art if you want to go ahead and take a look at it. Now we're going to take off from Dulles and go to National and talk about the other airport in the story here. And the National Terminal, I think, is actually quite a beautiful and a graceful building, has a lot of little hidden architectural elements. Most of these are still intact. Unfortunately, the compass rose, this is a photograph from earlier, that was covered over by a later floor inlay. And then unfortunately, this wonderful, elegant entrance into what had been the dining room also was removed later in time. But most of the other pieces, if you look around the terminal, you begin to see these little bits of art. And interesting also just the time period. You'll notice that some of these symbols ended up, I mean, you know, the solar disk and the barley are very recognizable. But again, if you look at this eagle in the window here, that is what would come to be essentially a German Nazi eagle. But again, this was a period before fascism had risen its head. And so again, also here, this finial, that also ended up becoming another fascist symbol. But when this building was built in 38, 39, they had yet to get those connotations. We also have done what I would like to call architectural archaeology in the main terminal. This is the original dining room, which was in the middle period, you can see here, turned into a cafeteria, was eventually then restored back into a combination of an exhibit hall and a club for one of the airlines. And so it was fun for me as an archaeologist to actually begin to poke above the ceilings and below the floors and find out that we actually had parts of the original dining room that could be restored. And so on the left, you see a photograph of the dining room as it would have looked in the 1940s. And there is a photograph of what it looks like today. So again, very exciting times. Also, another piece of this sort of architectural archaeology, I got a call from the ops office that they had found this propeller on the floor. And so we went and took a look at it. And as we began to pull down the partitions and everything, we began to realize that this was the old VIP lounge that had been built for FDR. It's actually on the ground level because at that point he was in a wheelchair. And so he would be brought into this waiting room and then escorted out to the plane without having to go up and down any stairs. And in fact, he got here by, there's a unloading dock in the tunnel under the terminal where he would get out of the car and then be able to come in here. Another really interesting part of this is actually original furnishings that we found in the attic, which we've been back to put into place. And if you look over here on this black and white, there's an unusual piece of furniture right here. And we finally figured out that that is actually a wheelchair desk that had been set up so that he could wheel under there and use it as a writing surface. So again, this is actually in the operations office, so it is not open to the public except by appointment. But again, we have given tours in the past, and I'm sure we will in the future. Now, let's get on to our main topic. This is Abingdon, which was a plantation house established on the location where the airport would eventually be built. And through the process of many years, we have done stabilization of the ruins that were on the site, interpretation of the history of the site, and a lot of archaeology to find out what the people's lives would have been like. The story starts before the Europeans arrived. We do have some evidence of prehistoric occupation of the landform where the airport would be built, some of them in really unusual contexts. We found a few prehistoric spear points spattered around on the site. It appears that they maybe, again, the site was being used prehistorically before the plantation was being built. But then we also had some very unusual connections between the artifacts and the features from the building. This little celt we have here was found in the kitchen building, but above the floor level. So again, it's not that it was underneath the building was built on top of it. Somebody found this and brought it inside and put it in the kitchen. And so when the kitchen fell down, it just ended up in the dirt in the floor where we found it. The other unusual thing is, as we were excavating the builder's trench of the main house, we ended up finding a lot of shell. And it was common for shell to be burned to make the lime to make mortar. And so again, we think that may have been why it was on the site. But interestingly, we have small fragments of prehistoric pottery mixed into the shell in the builder's trench. And our interpretation of that is it appears that the shell was being mined from a prehistoric shell mitten somewhere along the Potomac shoreline. And they were using those shells to then make the lime. And then what was left over was dumped in the builder's trench once the foundation was completed. The land that became Abingdon was actually part of a 6,000 acre land grant that was given to a British Captain Howson as payment for bringing a ship full of settlers to Virginia. He did not hold on to it long. He turned around in less than a year and sold it to the Alexanders, for whom Alexandria is named, for a pound of tobacco an acre, which is a heck of a price for land in Fairfax or Alexandria today. There are no contemporary images of the building, but we assume it was a, again, fairly simple 5-bay, story and a half, central hallway, double parlor house. From the evidence we have, that upper right-hand window would have been the room where George Washington stayed when he came to visit. Because again, Mount Vernon is just down the road. And as was mentioned in the last talk, the enslaved populations of Abingdon, which included Martha's slaves from her estate, where there was a lot of intermixing and intermarrying between the populations at Mount Vernon and Abingdon. And so again, the stories of these two areas are completely intermixed and intertwined. The Alexanders sold the property to John Parke Custis, who was the son of Martha from her first marriage. And then he married Eleanor, and they moved into Mount Vernon in order to be close to, moved into Abingdon in order to be close to the family in Mount Vernon. Unfortunately, it does not appear that he was a particularly shrewd businessman. He ended up having a lot of problems with debts, and also purchased the property with what was essentially a balloon interest payment. He was warned against this by his father-in-law, and I mean by his father, adopted father. And unfortunately, he went through with the deal, and it ended up coming back to bite him. He eventually died down in Yorktown, and the property was in severe financial problems. And Washington eventually interceded, and the Alexanders allowed them to basically pay rent for the time they had been there and got the property back. The two youngest of the children from the Custis family were born at at Abingdon. So this is Nellie, Eleanor, and little George Park Custis, or Little Wash. So they were both born at Abingdon in that house. And Nellie Custis, the role that she began to play later in sort of the history of Mount Vernon, she became a very famous figure. And so the Nellie Custis birthplace, which is what Abingdon was, sort of that formed a little bit of protective bubble around the site that helped its preservation as we go through time. Again, John Park Custis caught camp fever at Yorktown and died. Washington interceded to go ahead and get Eleanor released from the mortgage payment. She stayed on the property, renting it, remarried a Dr. Stewart, and then they eventually, the two youngest children actually were then adopted by the Washingtons and moved to Mount Vernon. So here is Little Wash and Nellie in a famous portrait with George and Martha. And in the background, that is probably Billy Lee, who was one of Washington's grooms. And we're going to tell a little bit more of a story about him as we get further down into the history. The house was then sold to the Wise family. They famously sat in the front yard and watched the Capitol as it burned during the War of 1812. It then passed on to the Hunter family. They were a famous Confederate military family, and that unfortunately was part of the problem, because during the war, there was a rule that they made it that the property taxes needed to be paid in person. And obviously a Confederate general was not coming to Washington to pay the taxes on Abingdon, so the property was seized, was actually turned into a Civil War encampment during the war period. And then after the war, the family sued to try to get the property back. They hired a good lawyer. This is Garfield, who ended up going ahead and being president. He argued the case in front of the Supreme Court and got the house back to the Hunter family. In its later time period, the area of the downhill towards the water was opened up as a gravel pit and as a clay yard. And so during its later time periods, Abingdon was just the house where the foreman that ran the smooth gravel company lived. And again, we know that the house had begun to fall into disrepair. Here's a shot you can see. It looks like actually somebody's been taking some of the windows and things out. At some point, the property burned. And there's been some speculation that the railroad that was right next to it really wanted that land and would really preferred not to have the house there. But whatever happened, pretty soon after the house burned down in the 30s, the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities stepped in, stabilized the ruins, unfortunately with a pretty heavy hand, basically just sort of slapping Portland cement on everything. But they did go ahead and put up a plaque and some walkways and an opportunity to be able to get up there and to visit the site. But the site was in pretty rough shape by the time we got to actually beginning the preservation program. Here's an early shot showing what the main house looked like. It was called Abingdon Ruins, and again, it had been in a ruined state until we started the current project. Again, this is a shot of National Airport. As some of you may know, most of the airport is actually on made land. We actually just filled in what had been a series of mud flats in the Potomac. And so if you look up in here, you see what's called the hill up here. Abingdon is right in the middle of that. And again, it's being preserved as the airport is being built up around it. Actually, this is an early plan for the airport, and it actually notes the location of Abingdon. So it already was on people's radar that it was going to be something that was going to be protected. And it's actually interesting because Abingdon can be sort of seen as a story about historic preservation too. I mean, again, the fact that it was preserved, the association came in the 1930s and began the preservation. The Port Authority then went through the process of having it listed on the National Register in the 1990s. And then just a couple of years ago, the Daughters of American Revolution came out and commemorated John Alexander and Abingdon. And so again, the preservation of Abingdon has now been going on, for quite a long time. Abingdon, again, because of its association with Nellie Custis, really sort of survived the building of the airport. During the war, the airport was a major Air Force base, Army Air Corps base, actually. You can see all of these barracks over here. And again, Abingdon is sort of stuck back in the trees here. This is a shot that shows that there is actually a radar tower, was built awfully close to the site. There's also sort of a funny story that the Nellie Custis Airmen's Lounge, which was the officers' club for the base, was built so close to the Abingdon plantation that the base commander thought the chimney stack was going to fall onto the bar. And so we asked for permission to have it removed. And so the chimney was actually taken down in probably the 60s, 50s, while the base was most active. Again, you can see here, this is another massive military building that is no longer there. Over here, again, you can see Abingdon is preserved in this little grassy area. And so each time something got close to Abingdon, it basically continued to be protected. When I arrived, the airport was in the process of a massive redevelopment, trying to deal with basically a main terminal, which had grown out of control, of a series of obsolete secondary structures, roadway systems that were overloaded, unsustainable parking levels. And so it was part of the capital development program for National Airport that was the impetus for the preservation of Abingdon. When I arrived, the south garage, it was already constructed, this one on the right here. And there had been archaeological monitoring prior to the construction, but there was nothing intact that was going to be impacted. I was brought in basically to go ahead and help to go through the process of allowing the middle and north parking structure, what is now BC, to be built. And again, it looks from this photograph like Abingdon had really just been chunked into a box, but this was all that was left. I always tell people to sort of think about the airport as like a wedding cake. And all we really had left was the top hat on top of the groom. Everything else had been cut away either by the gravel pit, the brickyard, or eventually the grading for the airport. And so Abingdon, this was all that was intact. And eventually it was enclosed on the other side by the parking garage, but access to the site was actually increased and maintained so that people could get up there more easily than they had even in the past. The stabilization of the ruins and the archaeological excavation was carried out by a group from Greenhorn O'Mara. And actually Liz Crowell, who is one of our planners today, was actually on that team. And I think I saw Ben Fischler in the audience, and he was actually the crew chief. So it was a really remarkable excavation. We found a lot of really interesting material from a lot of different periods, a lot of different time periods, and also groups. The only piece of Wedgwood cauliflower ware I've ever seen on archaeological excavation we found up there, as well as the more utilitarian 19th century wares that would have been used by the people that operated the house during the later time period. And then, as we also talked about, we did find some Kalana ware and some other artifacts that we can directly connect to the enslaved population. This was, again, the stabilization plan. The ruins really were unstable. They were the Portland cement that had been put in the 30s basically locked the brick into chunks. And so rather than individual bricks falling, whole walls had fallen. And so it became pretty clear that trying to stabilize the ruins themselves was going to be very complicated. And so what we decided to do was actually just basically cover the archaeological remains, the foundation of the building, and then float a new foundation on top of it to help to interpret it so that the site is preserved underneath and the new construction is not then impacting the resources below it. And so again, you can see that basically this is the entrance to the site is from a connector between the two garages. There's an ADA accessible path that takes you up the site. And there's a series then of stabilized ruins, interpretive exhibits, and a nice sort of like park-like setting. This is actually my favorite place on the airport. Again, it's kind of amazing when you can think that you're standing on this landform and that the entire Washington, D.C. has grown up around you. And again, at that time period, you would have looked down to the water across the river at the swamp that was going to become Washington, D.C. And so again, really, I think it's an amazing place to see the juxtaposition. Here you are in the middle of a 21st century buzzing, again, planes taking off, trains going by, but still in a colonial landscape. This is the main structure. Again, you can see here is the central parlor and then the central hallway, the two parlors. The two hearths are actually quite interesting. Again, this is a recreation of the hearth that is actually encapsulated below it. And it again, originally had been a single hearth, but at some point had been reconstructed to allow two separate hearths into clearly what were two different rooms on this left-hand side of the main hallway. And again, this is the main hearth, which again would have been the one that produced most of the heat. Probably not most of the cooking. As you can see behind here, we have a second building. This is the only one that we have direct evidence of, although we know that there were other structures up there. And so this is what is being identified as the kitchen and also probably laundry. You can see it has this interesting H-shaped hearth, meaning again that you could have a hearth on one side, and again, there's a room partition archaeologically. So again, the larger space, probably the kitchen, the other one, probably the laundry. This is the only standing wall that we had, and we also now installed a permanent set of adjustable supports to keep that in place, and as we can adjust it so as it moves, it is not damaged. In the main terminal, we have an exhibit hall that talks about both the history of the airport and Abingdon. This one talking about, again, the range of materials all the way from prehistory up through the industrial period. We also have a discussion of the hierarchy, the social structure from, again, the Afro-American slaves who were the largest population and did most of the work, up to potentially indentured servants, and then the folks in the main house, and then eventually the elite family and the tea wares and the fine materials that are again being brought into the Virginia from around the world. One of the other panels we do talks about the connection of the Virginia colony, literally bringing ceramics in from China, from Iberia, from all over the world into Virginia, into Alexandria, and into the Abington household. We are beginning to do a reinterpretation. We're actually doing research now to look a little bit more detailed. These exhibits were put in Abingdon back in the 90s. And although we, talked about the enslaved population, again, like many people, we sort of were more focused on the big names and the more famous folks. And so again, rather than focusing in on the Custuses and the Alexanders and the Hunters, this new research is going to be looking more at the lives of the enslaved population. What was it like to have cooked in that kitchen? What was the work that would have been done in the fields? Where were the slave quarters? There's a lot of information that we don't know, and we're beginning to go ahead and do that. Obviously, Alexandria is right down the street, and it was a major slave shipping and sales point. And so again, we know probably where the slaves were coming from, but we don't know much more about them. And again, it's this idea, you have two portraits here of Washington, where literally in the shadows, there is a Black figure. again, Billy Lee was, one of his favorite grooms. And so again, the fact that he's shown in the portrait is really interesting. But again, we know very little about the lives of any of these people. And so that's what we're beginning to reach into. Now, one of the things that, is begin to look, this is an inventory from 1849 of Abingdon. And, one thing that really does jump out when you begin to look at it is just the sense of, the valuation of the possessions of the family. And so here we have a sorrel mare, 4 years old, worth $100. On the same page, we have Michael, a man of 50, worth $100. And so again, I mean, this is literally, and the fact that the cattle and the slaves are listed side by side, again, I think is a really telling part of the history, and not an easy one to tell. And so something that we're working on now, and that we hope to be able to share with people. We are going to be putting in some new interpretive signage on the site. And so we're hoping that you can all come out and get a chance to visit someday. We are going to offer a tour on May 1st. Because the site is outside, we can have a safe, socially distant tour. And so if there is interest, we will definitely do that. If not, we certainly recommend that you come out to the airport when you have an opportunity, not only to visit Abingdon, but also in the main terminal, we have a nice little exhibit hall that has materials both on the history of Abingdon, also artifacts from the history of the airport. This is actually, this lower right hand is an original glass panel that was part of the main waiting room. We found this up in the attic of the carpentry shop, and we're able to go ahead and build a custom case. And so again, the airport is its own little museum. And so we urge you to come and visit. Also, we aren't really fundraising, but again, we are all looking forward to when you can come back and start flying again. Both airports, like everyone else, are struggling. And so we are waiting for the vaccine and for air travel to come back. And so people can go back to visiting the airports and hearing the stories that they have to tell. One of the ones we are just about to tell is, as you may know, the metro is being extended out to Dulles. And as part of that plan, there will be an interpretive exhibit program as you come from the station into the terminal that will explore the history of the airport all the way from prehistory through the Arrow-Saarinen architectural design process, the construction, and then the expansion of the airport from its original size to where it is today. And so again, we hope that you get a chance to come and visit us when we're open again. And I think that is going to be the end of the presentation. So I think we've got plenty of time now for questions and answers. So I will, let's see, I think I have this.
We have one question in the chat, Henry, about where are the Abingdon House collections curated? Is there an online collections database?
The artifacts were all, I mean, we have a small exhibit on airport. The rest of the artifacts were all sent down to the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and are permanently curated there. The airport, again, airports are not museums, although we have a lot of historic resources. And so again, we do have some material on exhibit, but most of the rest of it is there. The archaeological report does have the inventories in it, but we do not have that online. We are going to be developing some additional online materials for both the history of Abingdon, and then also we're doing another interpretation looking at the airport and its interaction with the George Washington Parkway. And so those will be going on exhibits going in probably the next year or so.
We have one about the source of the fill. So is the dike marsh the source of the fill used to create the land for the airport?
And actually, again, we won't go back and look at it, but basically what they did, they built a dike around the shallow, those mud flats in the Potomac. And then they tethered these massive hydraulic dredges that just went back and forth around the airport and pumped the hydraulic fill muck off the bottom into this like dike until basically it just filled it up. They would drain the water off, fill it up, drain the water off, and they took the dike down, and basically it was made land. Now, that raises some interesting challenges because 500 of our 700 acres are on unconsolidated fill. So if you want to build something on the airfield, you literally have to put in deep driven tiles because otherwise it just, it's like sitting on mud. Yeah.
It makes me really curious about how they made all of the land in Alexandria, because as I don't know how many of our viewers know, is it 2 or 3 blocks in downtown Alexandria is also made land. Originally,
same thing in Baltimore. I mean, at most major,
I'm really curious.
Port cities, and it was a combination. And it's interesting because we found examples in Baltimore of both just general filling. I mean, we talked about the siltation, where at some point it just got to be such a pain to have to continue to dredge them out that they would just extend the dock. And so
right, and I'm thinking with the city of Alexandria, that's all, a lot of that is late 18th century too. So they're doing this all by hand with you mentioned the hydraulic machines and draining out the water, and I'm like, how did they do this 200 years ago?
It's interesting because one of the other sites that we dug in Baltimore was actually down in what is now Little Italy, and that we got down and actually you could see how the land filling had been done. You could see them lapping, and it was weird too because you would think if you're filling land you would go from the shoreline out. And that's not how they did it, because you can tell that it's lapped in this direction. So they're bringing barges in and then just filling in. And so, yeah, it's really amazing that sometimes it was intentional, sometimes it just happened, of course. Now, one of the interesting effects of this is we probably have no underwater archaeology anywhere near National Airport because we know that the whole bottom was basically just sucked up. Now, we do occasionally, people will bring me like shark's teeth and things that they find on the site, because again, they would have been coming up into the fill. But any artifacts that are in the airfield are in a disturbed context, and the fill is so deep that we would have to go like 50 feet down before we could hit like a shipwreck or something that would be underneath of it.
Right. We have a couple of other questions about the Abingdon site in particular. Is there still more to learn from the site, or has everything essentially been excavated, or are you waiting for better resources to come in the future?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have any, we assiduously avoid any soil disturbance in the area just because we don't want to get into having to do archaeology if it's unnecessary. And so there is no plan for additional excavation. We are going to be doing some additional research in order to flesh out the story of the enslaved population. And a lot of that is new information that researchers have uncovered that we didn't have in the 90s. So we're looking forward, again, to working with Sean and some of his folks and trying to paint a little bit of a richer picture of what people's lives would have been like. And, again, I think I saw a post recently about, if you're doing history and it's making you happy, you're probably not doing it right. Is that, these are really hard stories. When you begin to dig into these people's lives and the lives of, again, even the Washington slaves probably had it better off than some other enslaved populations. But it was really pretty horrible, when you're informed that you're going to be a wedding gift to somebody. When, you're rotated from Philadelphia back to Mount Vernon every 6 months to avoid you getting your freedom. And then you die on that trip. And again, these are tough stories to tell, but again, I think it's good that we are, as historians and archaeologists, beginning to look into what may be those uncomfortable truths and to tell those stories.
Right. We have a question about the land. How many acres was the original plantation? Do we know what kind of crops they were growing? And how many enslaved people were on the property? It's a lot of questions.
Original,
Sorry.
the house in land grant was 6,000 acres. So that would have been, Arlington, probably all the way over to Alexandria. I believe that the the core of the plantation itself was about 900. And we know that and one of the things that's tricky is because of the association of Mount Vernon and the intermixing of the Custis slaves, and then little George Washington goes on to build Arlington House. And so again, the slaves at Arlington are all sort of intermixed and married. And so it's a little bit tough, but we know there were probably something like 300 slaves at the height. And again, all the different kinds of activities that you would have seen on a plantation. So we're pretty sure there was a fishery. We know that there would have been, again, tobacco, probably the same sort of movement, again, the growing tobacco in the earlier colonial time period, and then a shift into a more diversified, crops of grain. It was a sort of a standard thing that happened in a lot of Middle Atlantic. Tobacco depleted the soils, and then a market began to grow because of development in the Caribbean for a need for grain. And so wheat became much more profitable. And so people started, not growing cotton and not growing tobacco, but shifting over to wheat.
Mm-hmm. Are there any books written on the history of Abingdon?
There were a couple of, there's a booklet that was written by, I believe the woman's name was Templeton, who was a local historian. There's the archaeological report, which again, there are some, restrictions to getting archaeological reports, but I think if a researcher would certainly be able to get that. We did 3 interpretive videos, which are actually part of the exhibit. But I don't think that there's actually ever been a book published on it. There is a local researcher, Dr. Tom Foster, who wrote an article about the enslaved population and its role sort of in the slave economy. But again, I don't believe that there's actually an Abingdon book written yet, but who knows?
We have some questions about what WSP stands for.
Williams Service Group. I knew you should. Williams, again, it's weird. It's a Canadian firm. It actually, the name had to do with its original incarnation, which was like Williams, like Service Partners. But now, it's like WSP, and almost nobody knows what it's named. We originally, the work that I was doing there was actually with Parsons Brinkerhoff. And that was another engineering American firm that had been around for about 150 years. We were purchased about 5 years ago by the WSP, which is a Canadian-British firm. And again, we are international transportation planning. Any major transportation project you can mention in the area, we probably have had our fingers in.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking at the time, and I'm also noticing you've mentioned the exhibit at National quite a number of times, and the exhibit is still open for people to visit, if I recall.
Right.
It is between Terminal A and Terminal B. It's a little tricky to miss.
Yeah, basically, it's a sort of a shame. The exhibit hall, showed you some photographs of the restored dining room. The exhibit hall used to be up in a part of what had been the dining room, but then with our inevitable airline mergers, they ended up taking the entire club space. And so now if you go into Terminal A, the old terminal, basically, and you turn left or right, depending on which door you come in, there's a hallway where the conference center is, and all of the exhibits are there. So again, they're very easily accessible. And to get to Abingdon, you can basically you can go by Metro and through a Garage BC. You can park in either garage. You can drive your bike, and there's a bike rack behind the garage. You can walk, and you can.
And there are signs on the property to point you to Abingdon.
There are, and again, unfortunately, airports are very dynamic places, and so I think there were 32 signs. I don't think there are 32 signs yet left, but we're going to put some new in because somebody had noted the fact that they came looking for the site and had a hard time finding
Well, I think it's amazing. I'm also really looking forward to our field trip on May 1st at 11 a.m. with Henry. We have not opened registration yet for that field trip. We are waiting to see a little bit better on where the COVID restrictions land us. But we're hoping to be able to take a reasonably sized group and have a guided experience with Henry at the site, and also have an opportunity for you to explore the exhibit hall as well. There is a $5 suggested donation for that program. That being
And
said,
someday, probably not in May, but at some point in the future, when travel restrictions are, not an issue, we also have offered tours of the main terminal to get an opportunity to actually go and see the FDR suite, to go up into the dining room, and then even something as prosaic as where we get our IDs is actually a recreation of the old post office. And so there's little hidden historic corners of the terminal, which are fun to show people, because most of them are not easily accessible in public.
so we will open up registration for our tour on May 1st by emailing everyone who registered for this program today. So whatever email you put into the Eventbrite system, we will email you there with that opportunity as soon as we open it. As for the rest of our program today, we are just wrapping up. Just as a reminder, we would love to know what you thought about this program. I've dropped the link for the evaluation into the chat. You can click on it there. You'll also get it in a little bit as an email in your inbox. We also appreciate all of you taking time to spend time with us today, and we would love your support by participating in other programs like this one with us. Financial support also makes programs like this one possible. We're able to connect with speakers, we're able to pay for our Zoom space and make this all happen with donations from people like you. We'll have some direct links to donations to everyone who accepts donations in that way in that email you're going to get shortly. And of course, everyone has mentioned other ways that you can support those organizations as well. I'm looking forward to flying out of National when everything's a little bit safer.
Looking forward to have everybody come back.